here to the springboard for our discussion this evening is a play called Bear Witness, which is being presented at the Theatre Royal in November. And we are very fortunate to have the playwright with us this evening. So we'll be talking about the play and about some of the issues that revolve around the play. Our other guests, we have Rebecca Fitzgibbon, who is a cultural columnist for The Mercury and a reporter on Note, and has interesting connections. Comes from a kind of journalistic family, really. It's in the blood with Rebecca.
Photojournalism is. Yeah.
Photojournalism, right. And also we have John Martinkus, who is lecturer in journalism, media and communications at UTAS, and who also has a history of photojournalism, of war reporting.
Yes,
yeah.
About 10 years. Yeah.
About 10 years
yeah.
of working as a war correspondent. The kind of simple synopsis is it's the story of a young woman named Danny, who's an Australian reporter who does journalist, yes, photojournalist, who does a kind of domestic issues and fashion shoots and so on and so forth. And then she gets an opportunity to do an overseas gig. She gets sent off to do an overseas gig. Out of that comes an opportunity to go to a war zone. And she gets a taste for being a photojournalist in a war zone, and then we follow her through the play as she goes to a variety of different theatres of war, including Iraq and East Timor. Is that correct?
Yeah, it starts in the Balkans, really.
Yes.
Yeah, and then it kind of covers the span when film was the currency of photographers back then, and before digital media, really. So then it covers Timor, and then it kind of ends in Iraq. Yeah.
So that's like the barest thread of what the plot is. But along the way, there's kind of a plethora of ethical and aesthetic issues get raised by the play. So I suppose to start to bring you into the conversation of your connections with the whole area of war journalism and photojournalism, what first attracted you to this topic, to this subject?
I had a friend whose husband was a photojournalist in Gaza at the time of the Iraq War, and he had gone over there as a freelancer, and he couldn't get anyone to cover his images, and a lot of the freelancers and a lot of the photographers over there in Gaza and Israel at the time couldn't get their work even looked at by the international news agencies because all the attention was on Iraq. And he was taking enormous risks, with his life, and she was, when he came back, she reckoned that he had post-traumatic stress disorder, and predictably he didn't see it that way. And he and I had worked together on some kind of regional theatre projects up in Victoria, and I just began to kind of realise that to write a play about the world of photojournalism would make a kick-ass piece of theatre. That was my first interest. But I'm also really interested in the news and the media and the politics of power and the politics of whose voices get heard and in what context, and the context of when is a war sexy, when does it get a lot of coverage, when it doesn't get coverage. In fact, I used John's book, During the War, set in Timor, a lot, actually, because I thought it was a really good example of Australian journalists. Some of them had been going back and forth to Timor for years, but they couldn't get the story out there until the election was happening, and then wham, bam, suddenly it was a big sexy war. All the international media were landing on East Timor. So there was some really kind of juicy stuff. So I began to talk a lot about it with Rusty, this photographer. And he kind of introduced me to the world and books and documentaries and DVDs, and I just became quite intoxicated with the idea, thinking, no one had actually in Australia written a play set in the world of photojournalism. I thought, what a great dramatic premise, what a great dramatic, and so I had a friend who was a photographer for The Age as well, and we worked out a scenario. Well, how would you get a big gig? It's really hard to get the big gig. What breaks you? And so we talked about loads of scenarios of how a young cadet journalist would actually even end up in the Balkans. And I kind of wanted to use the Balkans because that was Rusty's first big gig from being a domestic newspaper photographer in Northern Ireland. That's where he had grown up. He'd also been in Timor after the election had happened. And then I did a lot of interviews with a lot of photojournalists from different parts of the world and a lot of Australians. and then began to kind of sketch scenes. That's kind of...
So there's about 5 years worth of research there, isn't there, before
There's
you
a lot of...
really kind of got to the...
Yeah, well, I was writing it as I went, but we were also workshopping it to establish the form, because what we knew was as well, you know, we're kind of contemporary theatre makers. We didn't want to kind of put TV on stage, have just talking heads forever moralising about the moral dilemmas that they face, and then have projected images that kind of then give you the whole story. We wanted to kind of really, you know, great theatre is kind of poetry on stage, and it works on metaphor, and I think great images are the metaphors of our time. You know, and the unforgettable images of our time are our kind of collective communal memory. So I thought, so what we're looking at is she's a traumatised journalist by the time we meet her, and through photograph by photograph she's going back over her life to make sense of this momentous event that's actually happened to her in recent times. So it's not a kind of linear piece, it's quite fragmented at the start, so you've got to kind of hang in there for the first 20 minutes, and then it gets closer and closer as we realise what's happened. It's a ripping yarn of a narrative, which is the kind of theatre I like, but it's very kind of got great videography that suggests images,
and
actors make images.
Even on the page, it races along. Like, I mean, it hurdles. Hurdles through. You really have to kind of keep up with it. It's great. It's fantastic that way.
You won't get bored.
No, absolutely not. And it does also, I guess what's really interesting about it is that you kind of throw these issues up in the air, and some of them are, you know, huge. The biggest sort of issues. And I'm not saying that you leave them unresolved, but in a sense you do. I mean, you leave us with these kind of big questions for us all to kind of walk away with, which is fantastic.
Which I think is that's what I want from theatre, because there's no one answer. It's a Rubik's Cube, and what you will see in a character, and a decision of a character, you will agree with, and then you won't. You will actually, you know, disagree with what they said, or how they did that, or something shocking that a character says. So kind of just about every event and every line in the play has been said to me at some particular time, or I've read it, or I've used a little anecdote from a war journalist or a photographer.
This is fantastic.
The answer's on you to talk about how you feel about it, because we're all purveyors of media, we're all purveyors of these images, and we all understand the world based on what gets reported, basically, you know.
Yeah. So now you've been through a war.
Yeah, I've been through many. Yeah, look, it's funny actually, because as you're talking, I'm kind of like, you know,
It's all coming back.
Yeah,
Trauma's
reflecting
coming
on
back.
10 years of covering. I mean, I'll briefly explain. I started out as a correspondent in Timor in the mid-90s. I basically made a name there, and you know, basically positioned myself to cover it when it became a big story, and which was like a crash course in being introduced to the world's media. And really not very many. We're only talking about 100 people who cover wars, you know.
In the world?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's actually quite small. You see the same people all the time.
We're still alive.
It's interesting. I can remember like sort of 2008, having a New Year's party in Kabul, and there was 11 of us there, you know, and that was the foreign press corps.
Wow.
You know, and that's including Reuters, AFP, CNN, BBC,
One each.
AP, yeah.
So to what extent, I mean, we're getting into some of the issues that you deal with in the play now, to what extent does the decision on which wars are just wars or whatever start right at that very base level of the journalists in the field deciding who's right and who's wrong?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Because I would assume that those sort of decisions are made at kind of Rupert Murdoch level, but maybe it's
exactly.
not.
Well, in the case of Timor, for example, I can remember going back to Timor. I'd set myself up there in '98. I had a place where I was living. I went back there, and you know, I arrived back from Darwin. Some Timorists come and see me and say, "Oh, there's been 3 people killed down, you know, blah blah blah. It's part of town." And I honestly was like, I can't sell that. You know, I can't sell 3 deaths. I need at least 20. And you know, and that was really sad. But then within a week, because the Australian government changed its position on Timor and started pushing the Indonesians to have a referendum, then bang, you had all this correspondence come in, and any little incident was huge news. And all of a sudden, you know, I was at the centre of the fucking media universe. Sorry.
With regard to the characters and the way that they, like, where they come out the other end, and
Yeah.
the way that you come out the other end, and I think you were talking about.
I have a family member with
Yeah. And one of the people who you reference in the play, one of the photojournalists you reference is Don McCullen, and and which raises a whole
shot that he
and raises a whole issue about the manipulation of the image and stuff. But I found this beautiful thing that he said, this really lovely thing that he said. So he was a war correspondent, photojournalist during the Vietnam War, and he said, I have been manipulated, and I have in turn manipulated others by recording their responses to suffering and misery. So there is guilt in every direction. Guilt because I was able to walk away while this man was dying of starvation or being murdered by another man with a gun. And I am tired of guilt, tired of saying to myself, I didn't kill that man on that photograph. I didn't starve that child. That's why I want to photograph landscapes and flowers. I am sentencing myself to peace.
Beautiful, yeah.
Extraordinary, extraordinary. So again, is that your experience of people when they come out the other end of this? What do they come out with? Where do you go after that?
It varies. It just really varies wildly.
They become sub-editors.
Right.
For academics.
You have some connection, of course, with photojournalism through your father.
Yes, yeah. And my dad's retired now, and he never saw active duty as a photojournalist. But I have always been aware that the picture is usually staged, maybe not so much in action, direct action, but there has been a lot of documentation of war zone or conflict photography where it's deadline at 4 p.m. There was meant to be a riot at 2 p.m. The riot's not happening. There's no one on the streets. We'll just get this guy to hold this bottle, and we had a smoke machine with us. And I mean, there is actually there are photo essays documenting the staging of photojournalism in conflict zones because something needs to go to press. And the riot does happen at 5 p.m. The deadline is 4 p.m. But there's a lot of staging of that kind of thing, which. I mean, it's a different issue to how photos are misrepresented with stories and headlines.
Here's another big issue.
You telling that story actually reminds me of an incident where I can remember actually 2 French TV journalists, trying to rev up a crowd at a demonstration, and it was potentially it was potentially really inflammatory because some of the Indonesians could have opened fire.
Yes,
and we were telling them stop.
I mean, you see it in all media, even in a harmless lifestyle story where you know that the story won't get a run if there's not a picture that's engaging. When someone flicks through the paper, it needs to be an engaging picture. That's the harmless end of knowing that the picture sells the story. But in conflict zones, it's a different thing, and it can be inflammatory and worsen the situation.
Yeah.
Cost lives.
Yeah.
I know one we actually used as a little anecdote that where 2 journalists are arguing in the Timor section of the play, and one of them recounts. One of them wants to go to the Portuguese room in the Turismo Hotel where the Portuguese are having a party, and the guy goes, "No, I'm not going there. Fuck them." They almost got some Indonesian students killed, and it's based on a story out of your book where the Portuguese journalist tried to get some local Timorese students to raise a Portuguese flag, and someone says, "Why not the Timorese flag?" And they said, "Well, they were trying to sell the footage to Portuguese television." And some people ran it because they didn't know the difference, and they were just naive. And you have that situation in Timor where people are just landing and then filing a story for the 4 o'clock morning news bulletins in Europe, and just reading from the press release that have been given to them by the army spokespeople. Someone said that writing a play is like, it takes a truckload of petals to make a little essence of a bottle of perfume. I've just got enough for a 4-part miniseries of material, and what you'll see is an hour and 20 minutes on stage. If I'd written a whole huge long section on Timor, it's about to tell the whole history of the media's involvement. And I also had News Limited journalists coming out with the horns on already, and I just had to kind of chuck a lot of it out, and just distill it down to some really key moments. But there were some key points I wanted to make with Timor. And I wanted to create a Timorese character in collaboration with the Timorese. So I used Alex Tillman help me collaborate on that character, who was a translator for the media, who John would know. But yeah, I've not read Heroes. Yeah, he's done a lot of stuff.
And when you see the players, I'm sure you all will find that it is extraordinarily dense.
Yeah,
already.
There's a lot in there.
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, you'll be thinking about it for days. Yeah.
All right, because we're in Fuller's, I bought a book on the way through. I made a contribution to the coffers, so I will finish with a quote from the play.
Is it
Camus. However, he knew that this chronicle could not be a story of definitive victory. It could only be the record of what had to be done and what, no doubt, would have to be done again. Against this terror and its weapons. For despite their own personal hardships, all these men, whilst not being saints, refused to give way to pestilence and did their best.
Camus?